welcome to our next episode of CyberTangent, where we will be talking about the R in GRC. We are joined today by Vicky Ames. Hi, Vicky. How are you?
Hi, Landon. I'm doing well. How about you?
Good, thank you. So Vicky has worked in the information security industry for over 20 years. She is the Director of Information Security at Marriott International, where she's responsible for the strategic direction and management of the organization's risk and vulnerability management programs. Vicky's experience also includes building and leading security programs for the federal government as well as the private sector. So you've been around the block, is that fair to say, Vicky?
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it.
So this concept of GRC is broadly defined and broadly appealing and applicable. How would you, let's just start this off by asking you, how would you describe the R, the risk part? How is that best thought of in the GRC world, in the governance, risk, and compliance world?
Sure. Risk is actually taking a look at specific things that you think will be happening in the future. So it's a little bit of divining the future and analyzing it from two perspectives. One is from a time frame perspective, meaning how likely do we think this event will happen in X amount of time? And then the other aspect is an impact. So how bad would it be if this thing happened? And then doing analysis to understand what would be an acceptable level of both of those things. You can reduce the likelihood of something happening, and you can reduce the impact of something happening. And that's really the risk management life cycle. You have to do that. And I think security practitioners have been doing that for a long, long time. We just haven't called it risk. And I think now there's truly a lot of people are focusing in now and calling it risk and applying some rigor to it.
So some of our listeners will be familiar with the GRC world and in particular this concept of the risk register. But for those who are not, can you give us a brief definition of a typical risk register? And then I'll have a couple other questions about it.
Sure. Risk register is a list of your risks that you have identified formally. So you have a lot of risks that are going on in your world, and you have to decide what that list is going to be. Some people like it at the very high level and look at risk very broadly. Things like open shares in my environment, for example, could be a risk. And some folks take a much more tactical approach and look at systems and say the system has these 4 vulnerabilities and that opens up to X number of risks. So some risk registers have a lot of entries on them and some risk registers have a few entries on them.
So as you know, we come at this pretty specifically from the cyber side. So here's my question about the risk registry. How well is cyber represented on a typical organization's risk registry?
Not very well, I have to say, at least from my experience. Cybersecurity is really starting to get some play at the executive level from the risk register perspective. And most organizations are doing risk management in a lot of different areas, as you identified, and for some reason have left out cyber. And I think now, with a lot of the incidents becoming front and center in the news, organizations are starting to take a look at it. So they're creeping onto the risk register. But I think it's going to take some time before it's truly an equal review of cyber risks as opposed to, say, physical risks.
We were at Nehemiah Security was at a trade conference not too long ago where there was a number of GRC professionals responsible for managing their risk register. And we took an informal poll, how many of them represented cyber in their risk register, and the percentage was very, very few. For the ones who did have cyber represented, they thought it was interesting how it was represented. And by that, I mean they were surprised by the fact that it did show up at the top of the list in some cases, and it only showed up in 1 or 2 cases. What have you seen with respect to companies that have actually taken cyber into account thus far in their risk register?
What I've seen is that some companies often, I think where everybody goes initially is patch management. I think that's one of the critical ones that I see on every risk register when I look around. And we absolutely do have a lot of exposure in that particular area, so I think it's a natural thing that folks focus in on. But after that, I think there are some broader, more strategic things that people need to be focusing in on, such as business continuity, which includes disaster recovery, and evaluating and making sure that the IT that supports critical business functions is available to function during times when disasters may be going on. And after that, looking more broadly out at our policies being effective and doing the things that they need to be doing to keep the organization at the appropriate level of risk.
Yeah, you make that mention, Vicky. It's a good one of the policies being represented. My understanding of the risk register is really to focus the organization where it should be focused to manage its risk optimally. So I'm going to ask you to use your imagination here. If you can imagine a day when cyber is well represented in that cyber risk register, how does that change the conversation within a large enterprise?
Well, that'll be a great day.
Yes.
And what I think folks will really start to understand is that there's even in any risk register, what you're trying to get to is the organizational's acceptable level of risk. You can't get rid of risk. You can only treat risk. And organizations will be focusing in on the risks associated with cyber like they do with everything else. And what that all boils down to, I think, at the end of the day, is a conversation around making sure that investments are being spent wisely. So when we're talking about risk, really what we need to be doing is talking with the C-suite and talking with the executives about if we see this exposure and we believe that it could translate into a certain dollar amount in terms of loss should the bad thing happen. So I'll just make up some numbers. We think that there's an exposure here. You might wind up costing the company $10 million. But if we implement this piece of technology, or if we change this policy, or if we enforce this policy a little bit better, we can reduce that potential exposure to a loss of maybe 1,500,000, somewhere in that range. And all you have to do is spend $1.5 million. Those are the kinds of conversations that you then start having. And those are the same conversations they're having with other areas of investment throughout the company. And that's when I think we're really going to start seeing cybersecurity as an equal player at the table.
Okay. It's this term acceptable level of risk. I suppose it makes sense if I think about it from some of the more mature functions within a business, like hedging currency risk or competitive risk. Cyber tends to be a little bit different. Where is the conversation at this point in time in how to measure acceptable level of risk with respect to cyber?
Yeah, it's very different for every company and every organization has their own set level of risk and what's really important to them. But it should be about what cyber does with respect to protecting the business and making sure that the business is still able to function, right? So when we're talking about any kind of risk is really all about making sure that the business can continue to do its core competencies. And cyber just needs to be a part of that conversation. But what we see now is people saying things like, and security practitioners have a tendency to talk in terms of worst case scenarios, right? And that's because we understand what the worst case scenario is. But what we need to do is really start talking about how that worst case scenario translates into an impact to the business, to the organization, and the impact has to be a financial one. So we really have to start quantifying risk and understanding how risk affects the bottom line of the business from a cyber perspective.
From your perspective, how far away are we from having our arms around this idea of the financial measurement around cyber risk?
It's going to take some time. This is a big switch, I think, for people when you start thinking about cyber risk, and you have to really start focusing down onto what is the specific loss event that you are concerned about. There are some methodologies out there and some organizations out there that offer the ability to do that, but it's hard. I mean, most organizations, if you're going to start, you want to start with kind of this qualification of high, medium, and low, and I think this risk is high, and I think this risk is medium, and you got to get people used to doing that before you can get down into something that's a lot more rigorous and a lot more formal that will then get you to be able to actually associate a dollar loss figure. So I think we're a ways away, but I think some organizations, if they have a relatively mature program today, could start looking at doing some of this quantification. It's amazing what you can measure when you start trying to actually measure things, and you don't think that you have a lot of data, but you have lots of historical data. So if you really want to, you have the capability of doing it today. It's just going to have to kind of flip the script on people and get them going and thinking in a different way about risk. And that's a big challenge.
So you're kind of going down this path. If you'll allow me to ask you to continue, what do you see as the main obstacles right now, Vicky, in between where we stand now and that measurement of and the quantification in financial terms of cyber risk?
Sure. Well, I think there's a large initially there's a large belief out there that this can't be done. And I do think that it can be done. We're doing it. We are using the FAIR methodology, the Factor Analysis of Information Risk methodology, and that is definitely helping us to get to the point where we can get down to that dollar quantification. And it also takes a lot of communication between security and the rest of the business and understanding exactly how the organization generates revenue. So if you don't understand how your organization works, if you don't understand exactly how your company makes money, that's one of the first things as a security practitioner you need to go back and understand. Because once you understand that, then you can fit your security world into what's really important to the business and start understanding how gaps in security can translate into leaks of dollars.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you to give us the inside skinny, Vicky. As a GRC professional, what does the GRC community think of cyber?
I really, that's hard for me to say, to be honest, but I think that people think that risk management and information security are two different things. And I honestly disagree. I think that information security folks have been doing risk management all along. It just hasn't been in this formal manner that the risk management professionals understand and get and want to do. And folks that are in risk management may or may not understand information security, but they are definitely good at, quantifying risks and understanding all other types of risks. So I think, honestly, there isn't really much of a difference. I think these two worlds could be easily merged, but I do think that right now there's still this concept that they're different, and I think, honestly, they need to merge into kind of a single entity.
Yeah, your previous comment about the need to understand how the business works and integrate your own operations into it was the inspiration for that question anyways, because I think you're right. I think there is a gap that needs to be bridged, and the business will force it to be bridged. It's just a matter of how fast we can do that.
Sure.
Okay, well, as you know, the title of our podcast here, Vicky, is CyberTangent. We do enjoy going on tangents. It's delightful to have you here, and I know that you do a lot of speaking. Let's go on a tangent here for just a moment. What has been a recent interesting talk, let's say, that you've done recently?
I did a really fun talk, actually, on just kind of the basics of cybersecurity to a very non-technical group, to actually a group of business people. And it was really fun in terms of we have some great headlines that we can grab now and make into slides, and you can kind of really get some wow factor with folks now. And it was just fun to kind of give them the concepts of, hey, the reason that we want you to choose good passwords is because if you don't, things like your bank account can get drained, and then, company resources can also be affected that way. So trying to give them examples in their personal lives about why they need to do personal security, and then trying to get them to understand that that's really why we're trying to get them to do security from a corporate perspective. That was a lot of fun.
Any interesting questions come from the crowd?
Well, I did give them I gave them a live demo of one of the tools that are out there that will show you the live attacks that are going on 24/7 by 365. And that really opened their eyes, and they also got a little scared about their TVs being able to listen to them. So I think they all went home and probably unplugged every device that they had and kind of sat in the quiet for 10 minutes.
Somebody must have asked about Alexa too, I'm sure, right?
Oh, all the time. Yeah, one person even said that they had Alexa, do that random laugh thing. I haven't had my Alexa do that yet, but I thought it was interesting that somebody there actually could verify that was actually happening.
That's interesting. And I know that you're a big consumer of podcasts yourself. What are your top 3 favorite?
Oh, man. I would say Reply All by Gimlet, probably Snap Judgment, and, Serial. Whenever they come out with a new Serial, I'm always hooked.
Okay. All 3 good ones. Great. Okay, so let's get back on topic as best we can, Vicky. Let's picture the successful future of GRC, the next generation, if you will, of GRC. Help us understand what's required. If it's helpful, we can think about it from a people and a process and a tool standpoint. But what's required to reach the next level of performance for GRC within the enterprise?
Wow. Well, I'll start with the tool, actually, because the one thing I'm still looking for that I can't get away from doing on spreadsheets is good reporting from a risk perspective. Okay. So we need to get the tools that are helping us capture risk and helping us analyze risk and come up with different levels of risk. We need them to get to the point where they're actually doing the level of reporting we need for the multiple audiences we need to communicate with. So I need executive level reporting. I need to have heat maps. I need to be able to understand if-then scenarios and be able to show the executives very visually how if we're at risk $10 million, but then we apply this treatment to it and it goes down to $2 million, I need to be able to easily show them that visually, as well as being able to talk to risk owners and the people that actually have to implement the treatment plans and show them risks and understand where they are relative to everybody else and why it's important for them to do the work. So the tools definitely need to mature and get there. They also need to help you do those calculations of risk, however you want to do them and whatever methodology you're going to be using. They need to be able to facilitate that and then easily help you understand risk and then communicate it out. From a people perspective, I think everybody in information security should take at least one class or course or training in risk management to understand what it is that they've really been doing for all this time and to understand what the folks that are doing risk analysis are really doing. There's oftentimes a fundamental philosophy that the people who are communicating the risk and the risk management team own the risk, and that needs to be stopped immediately, right? The people who are introducing the risk into the environment are the ones that own the risk. So I think there's some culture change that needs to occur there with respect to people understanding who's responsible for what when we're talking about risk, and how we need to approach the treatment is up to the senior level executives in the area that's introducing the risk. And so the folks that are actually managing the risk, well, I won't say managing the risk, but they're really just managing the tracking of the work that needs to be done. The organization owns that work. And it's the same thing with cybersecurity for the most part. I mean, sure, we can put in firewalls, we can put in technology and things like that, but many times, and most times now, I think this is also where we're headed, the folks who do the network management and the just operations, they're going to own the actual implementation of those devices. And security teams are going to do much more of a leading from the strategic aspect and just directing what needs to be done, and then having folks on the operations side do the implementation. And from a process perspective, I think people really need to start getting serious about doing risk management and getting to a level of rigor that's right for their company. I mean, not everybody wants to go out and build a whole cybersecurity risk management program. It doesn't need to be a large endeavor. It really doesn't. You can approach it from multiple different ways, and you have to figure out what's right for your organization today and then in the future.
You did a good job over the past couple of minutes painting the picture of how the organization owns the risk, and the risk team is really responsible for driving the tracking and the analysis and the reporting and even the communication. Can you talk a little bit more about that and help to paint the picture of what it looks like to be on the risk team?
Sure. Yeah, day in the life of the risk management team. Sure. So it's an interesting job because you are subject matter expert in many ways on many things. And sort of a normal day would be looking at, upcoming meetings. It's very meeting intensive, right? Okay. So I might have a meeting with the director of the information management team over here that's doing work on our network, the network team. And I might have to go talk to him about the 6 risks that are in his area currently and let him know that we are moving forward very well with the treatment plans that we all came up with together on 2 of them, but 4 of them are lagging behind because those teams have been reprioritized, and trying to understand from him if that's really what he wants done, or if this was more of a tactical thing that then we need to just go back and kind of reprioritize all the efforts so that we can get the appropriate focus on the risks that he wants to get done. Or he may say, hey, that's fine. I don't mind if we kick the treatment plan out another year. So do that conversation, then go over and talk with some of the technical folks about the specific things that they need to be doing to address a certain risk. They may have questions about, well, can we do this? Can we do that? Will this address it? Will this not address it? And we have to be able to at least talk with them and understand what it is that they're doing and come to some sort of agreement with them about the appropriate treatment of a specific risk. So you have to wear a lot of hats. You have to understand the environment. You have to understand the technical environment. You have to understand the business environment. Another meeting I frequently would have will be with the CIO and the CISO, and to talk with them about where we are with respect to risk management and how the treatments are being applied and whether folks need more resources or what's holding back our treatment plans from moving forward. And then there's also doing the actual analysis. So sitting with folks, trying to understand what specific loss event we're talking about, how much we really think that loss would be. And we actually use some actuarial tables that we've come up with that are standardizing that, but some of it isn't standardized. We don't know about some of these impacts yet. So trying to get enough information out of those people so we can make we can put together a reasonably good scale for those levels of impact. And then going back and plugging new risks into the risk register, doing the analysis, and preparing presentations for folks based off of that analysis, and then going out and helping make sure that everybody that we've done the risk analysis for understands what we've done and why, and then start communicating that out with them to a much broader audience. So a lot of different hats. The risk management folks really, I think, should be senior level folks. I mean, you always have to have some folks doing the work and grooming the next generation. But I really think that risk management is a very high level function that probably it oversees. I think I don't want to say oversees, but it certainly is. It's much more in the governance field than it is in terms of actual operations.
Yeah, and I see some challenges with that role, not the least of which is, as you said, wearing a lot of hats and connecting a lot of dots. This concept of, I'm going to ask a question about this concept of risk ownership, and ultimately I'm going to ask you where companies are, where large enterprises are with this idea of who owns the risk within an organization. But I'll tell a story first. Probably 6 or 8 months ago at this point in time, we were at a conference where a CISO of a major healthcare organization that owns many healthcare facilities was telling a story about how they were going through these risk ownership exercises. And a scenario came up, just a scenario, but they got to talk through all these, where one of their facilities down in Texas, hot in the middle of summer, was attacked by a cyber attacker who took over the HVAC system and jacked it up to 100 degrees. The facility, healthcare facility. The scenario that they were asked to walk through and got stuck on is who owns that risk? Is it the CISO's role to cut the HVAC system when it's 100 degrees outside in Texas? Or is it the HVAC guy's responsibility to cut the system? And who kind of quote unquote owns that risk? Obviously, what I'm highlighting is a very, very complex scenario. But it's amazing how many of these pop up in the cybersecurity industry, and it's only limited by our imagination. So here's my question. With that as a backdrop, Vicky, how sophisticated are organizations with respect to who owns risk and their ability to handle some of these types of scenarios, or simpler ones, more complex ones?
Sure. The simple ones are simple. They're pretty straightforward, although even the simple ones aren't so simple. So I've seen organizations, I'll go back to my initial patch management discussion. So in some organizations, the security team owns patch management. In other organizations, the operations team owns patch management. In some organizations, nobody knows who owns patch management. So you do have to go through the exercise of identifying who owns the systems. And it is very, very challenging. And the scenario you came up with is a great one, because I think that's more typical than you might think. And what really has to happen is that someone who, I hate to say this, but somebody who has authority over both sides, let's say the cybersecurity organization's over here and the maintenance team is over there, you need to have people that have the ability to direct both of those functions to then own that risk. So you have to maybe go up a notch and say, well, you know what? The vice president in charge of operations is responsible for maintenance as well as for network and cybersecurity. See if he is somebody that you could get to own that risk. Because the person that owns the risk really, nobody actually has 100% complete purview over the environment, right? It's all shared by everybody. But you have to have somebody who can actually direct resources, whether they be people or dollars or technology or whatever that can direct the resources that are going to actually address the situation. Yeah. So that's how you kind of have to do it. I mean, some organizations you can get co-ownership, but unfortunately that usually winds up turning into more of a budgetary, budgetary discussion, and it winds up being, it can get contentious at times rather than focusing in on actually addressing the risk. People are concerned about what else they're going to have to cut out of their budget and trying to kind of navigate that. So it's easier if you can, like I said, go to sort of a higher level in those scenarios, and somebody who can actually direct both or all three or all four. I mean, risk ownership, as you're pointing out, is not necessarily a very easy thing to come to in some cases.
Right. I suspect we'll continue to be surprised by the scenarios that can be thought up, right? Or play out in reality, perhaps even. Okay, this has been great, Vicky. I have one more question as we start wrapping up. As you're speaking to probably largely an audience of security professionals, what tips would you have for the security professionals of today to start integrating or to better integrate into the GRC model for large enterprises?
First and foremost, understand the business. I said it before, I'll keep saying this to everyone. Great. You have to understand you're there, you're drawing a salary. The company is making money through some 1, 10, 20 different ways. Understand how that's done, and understand where the money goes. Understand how your company allocates resources and where it puts a lot of resources. Those are the areas that you need to start understanding are what the business considers to be of the most importance. And go talk with those people and understand what it is that they do, so that then you can relate it back to what it is that you do. Because your ultimate goal there is to secure the business, and that means focusing in on things that the business finds important first, and then working your way back. I think the other challenge is to start thinking of things in terms of both likelihood and impact. I think we security practitioners often just think of impact. And yes, if you don't patch that, one esoteric system that's on your network that has a direct compromise capability, you could definitely have a large impact there. But think about what's in place that would be preventing somebody from actually leveraging that exploit, and understand what the likelihood of that actually happening truly is before you start sounding alarms. I think in security, we just focus on the impact, and sometimes that drives us in a direction that doesn't account for the likelihood, and I think the business folks definitely account for likelihood as well. So we need to start talking to them and understanding their perspectives. And finally, start understanding, sort of related to the first one, start understanding how you can translate what you're protecting in terms of dollars, because money is the language of business, and the people in the C-suite all understand dollars and cents. They may not understand rootkits. They may not understand what a DDoS is, except on a very high level, but they do understand dollars and cents. And if you can start translating what you do into preventing losses in dollars and cents, saving the company dollars and cents, you're going to start getting heard.
That's great. At this point, the investment in cyber has well exceeded flying under the radar, and the risks are way too high. Money is the language of business. I think that's a great summary, Vicky. I appreciate that. That's great. So, Vicky Ames, Director of Information Security at Marriott, this has been a wonderful conversation. I thank you for being on with us today, Vicky, and thank you for giving us your perspective of the R in GRC.
Well, thanks so very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Have a great day.
You too.